Welcome back, guys. Nathan here. Across the world, some of the most visited destinations have quietly become the deadliest tourist attractions, from a traveler climbing into dangerous river waters to a tourist slipping into a restricted section of a bell tower searching for a crowd-free shot, only for everything to end in the craziest way possible. It was August 14th, 2016, deep in Brazil's Amazon basin, where brown river water cut through dense jungle during the dry season. A wooden lodge stood roughly 20 feet above the muddy riverbank, surrounded by thick tree cover. The water level during August was unusually low, and that matters because low water means one thing out here. Fish concentrate in smaller pools, competition for food intensifies, and anything that moves near the surface becomes a target. Anyone living near that river already knew this. Zamira Thorne was 27 years old. She worked behind the counter at a small print shop back in Oregon. By most accounts, she was adventurous, outgoing, and driven by a genuine desire to experience things outside her routine. She'd spent close to a year saving for a solo backpacking trip through South America. She wanted something real, something worth talking about when she got home. What she also wanted was content, the kind of footage that makes people stop scrolling. She'd spent the evening filming short clips with two backpackers she'd just met, chasing what she called fearless travel moments. I get it, I really do. The urge to prove you were part of something incredible is really something you can be proud of. But being fearless isn't the same as being reckless. Earlier that afternoon, fishermen upstream had dumped animal scraps into the river. Lodge workers knew immediately what that meant. They spent most of the day warning tourists to stay out of the water, not casually, but repeatedly and specifically. The signs were hard to miss. Violence splashing near the dock, stripped fish carcasses drifting through the reeds, birds circling low overhead. A guide warned Zamira directly not to go near the ladder because piranhas were gathering during the feeding window. Rope barriers were tied across the lower platform entrance. The issue here is that the warning sign was laid out clearly. It just wasn't enough to stop Zamira, who had already made up her mind. A tourist nearby began throwing fish chunks into the river to attract dolphins, and a crowd gathered along the railing with phones out. Zamira removed her sandals, stepped around the rope barrier, and climbed down the dock ladder while staff yelled for her to stop. She was waist-deep in roughly 4 feet of murky brown water, holding her action camera above her head when the bites began. Witnesses described sudden splashing near the ladder moments after the scraps hit the surface about 10 feet away. The strikes across her ankles and calves came fast, not the cinematic swarm from movies, but scattered rapid bites that caused immediate pain. She tried climbing back up. Her foot slipped against algae-covered wood below the waterline. Her shin struck a lower support, and she dropped sideways into deeper water. The fall appeared to briefly disorient her. What followed was a desperate struggle to regain footing in water she could barely see through while bites continued across her legs and feet. Every time she slipped lower, her hands went under and the fish struck at her fingers. A lodge worker used a hooked pole to drag her closer, while another beat the water with an oar to scatter the fish. She pulled herself halfway up the ladder before her injured leg gave out, and she went back under. Witnesses stated her panicked thrashing made everything significantly worse. Staff eventually got her onto the platform using the pole, and a towel looped around her arm. Her lower legs were covered in dozens of bite wounds, most shallow and irregular, not the catastrophic injuries people might imagine. She was coughing up river water, drifting in and out of consciousness, breathing becoming increasingly shallow. The nearest medical station was only accessible by boat. Responders arrived nearly 40 minutes later. Investigators concluded Zamira died from a mix of drowning, head trauma from the fall, blood loss, and spending too long in the water. The bites were not considered the main cause. Authorities questioned the tourist who threw fish scraps into the river, though no major charges were announced in the days. After the incident, workers installed wooden barriers to block river access. Zamira's body was transported by canoe to a nearby town the next morning. The next case takes us into a flooded underground cave in Mexico, completely dark, completely alone, and no way out. It was July 22nd, 2017, just outside Tulum, Mexico. where the jungle grows dense above a hidden network of flooded limestone caves stretching for miles beneath the surface. The cenote sat in a clearing accessible by a dirt road, its opening a wide circular gap in the earth dropping into crystal-clear water roughly 80 feet down. Most days, the visibility inside was extraordinary, but the night before had brought heavy rainfall, and by morning the water carried a faint brown tint from disturbed sediment deep inside the cave system. Currents that were normally calm had strengthened through the narrower tunnel sections. The guides that morning knew the conditions were off. Peter Brooks was 41 years old. He worked a supervisory role at a warehouse facility back in Nevada. Long shifts, repetitive work, the kind of job that pays the bills but doesn't stay with you. What did stay with him was underwater cave diving content online. He'd spent months watching footage of divers moving through submerged limestone passages, light cutting through dark water, the silence of it. He booked the Mexico trip specifically for this cenote. Peter rented basic recreational scuba gear from a local outfitter. Standard tank, regulator, mask. No safety reel, no redundant air system, no cave certification. When the guide explained that several tunnel sections were restricted and required specialized training and equipment, Peter pushed back. He'd seen a hidden chamber in videos filmed deeper inside the network and asked about it specifically. The guide was clear. The passage narrowed dangerously, conditions were worse after the rain, and his gear wasn't enough. Most of us have been in situations where we heard a warning and quietly decided it didn't apply to us. But what I can't wrap my head around is that he's already old enough to know right from wrong and still chose to push it. He told another tourist within earshot that the danger made the footage better. The group descended into the cenote alongside other tourists, already underwater, filming light beams drifting through the cavern. Red rope barriers marked the restricted tunnel entrances along the cave walls. A guide became occupied, assisting a diver struggling with buoyancy near the main descent line. That was the window. Peter drifted away from the group and swam toward a restricted tunnel entrance about 80 feet below the surface. He ducked beneath the rope and went in. The tunnel was narrow from the start, barely wide enough for a single diver. Visibility collapsed almost immediately after his fins disturbed sediment along the cave floor. Inside the tunnel, permanent cave guidelines ran deeper, but without a safety reel clipped to them, Peter lost all orientation the moment the silt was kicked up, leaving him with no way to find his way back out. His tank scraped the limestone ceiling repeatedly as he pushed deeper. About 40 feet in, the rock closed in sharply enough that he had to twist his shoulders sideways to continue through. He kept going. Divers near the cavern entrance reported hearing metallic banging echoing through the cave walls, a tank repeatedly striking limestone in an enclosed space. That was the last external indication anyone had of where Peter was. Investigators pieced together what followed through physical evidence. Scrape marks along both tunnel walls, torn glove material lodged between rocks, and deep fin marks scratched into limestone in the direction he came from. The tank shifted sideways during an attempted reversal and jammed between the rock walls behind him. He was wedged face down, unable to move in either direction, in total darkness, with sediment too thick to see through. Air continued escaping as his regulator struck the wall repeatedly. If it were you down there, what would you do? Would you keep fighting against the rock? Or would you stop moving and hope for a miracle to happen? Air bubbles stopped rising from the tunnel entrance before guides could organize a response. When recovery divers reached Peter, he was pinned face down with the tank partially twisted off-center from his harness. The passage was too narrow to maneuver equipment easily, and it took several hours to remove his body. Investigators confirmed Peter drowned after exhausting his air supply while trapped inside the restriction. Workers later installed heavier fixed metal barriers across the restricted tunnel entrances. For our next case, I'm bringing you into a world that couldn't be more different. We're moving to a beachfront resort in Indonesia, where an entire family is caught completely off guard when the ocean itself disappears before the wave hits. It was September 28, 2018, along the western coast of Sulawesi, where Palu Bay had become a growing destination for international tourists, drawn by its calm waters and affordable beachfront resorts. The resort sat less than 300 feet from the shoreline. Open-air lobbies, glass-panel ocean views, beachfront restaurants. It was designed to put guests as close to the water as possible. Dean Foster, was 38 years old, working a physical maintenance role for a shipping operation back in Arizona. His wife Mary was 35, working at a local care facility. Their 22-year-old son Daniel joined them on what was supposed to be a straightforward family beach vacation, somewhere people specifically traveled to because it felt safe and well managed. There's something particularly hard about this case that I want to be upfront about, because what happened to the Foster family wasn't recklessness in the way we usually talk about on this channel. They were caught inside a moment where information broke down faster than anyone could process it before they ever had a clear chance to make the right call. The earthquake struck that afternoon, strong enough to knock drinks off tables throughout the resort. Staff received fragmented emergency radio messages suggesting possible tsunami activity, but details were unclear and changing minute to minute. The outdoor warning systems never broadcast clear evacuation instructions to guests. Workers near the front desk were overheard trying to confirm whether transport vehicles heading uphill were actually coming. No organized evacuation reached the guests still eating dinner in the beachfront restaurant. Then the ocean pulled back, not gradually, suddenly. Hundreds of feet of exposed wet sand where open water had been minutes before. Daniel walked out across the seafloor, pulling out his phone to record it. Dean followed with his own camera, drawn by something that looked unlike anything he'd seen before. Mary stayed closer to the resort entrance. Witnesses who survived stated she repeatedly urged both of them back as the situation around them started to feel uncertain rather than clearly directed. Some staff were moving inland. Others were still trying to guide guests, and from the outside, it wasn't obvious what the correct response was supposed to be. Dean kept filming. At first, I thought Dean followed Daniel to stop him. What I didn't expect was that instead of holding him back, he joined in, ignoring Mary as she tried to stop them both. Witnesses described a deep, low roaring from beyond the bay entrance. Not a visible wave, but a sound that arrived before anything could be seen. The surge hit the resort's glass beachfront panels with enough force to launch tables, luggage carts, and shattered glass across the entire lobby floor. Dean was struck by debris near the entrance and knocked against a concrete support column as floodwater exploded through the ground floor. Witnesses later found him pinned beneath collapsed wall sections near the restaurant side of the lobby. Investigators concluded he died from traumatic injuries sustained during the initial impact. Daniel disappeared beneath dark, churning water filled with broken furniture and debris. Mary reached the reception counter and attempted pulling him upward through the current when a second surge pushed through a side corridor and swept both of them deeper into the flooded hallway. Survivors on upper floors described the ground level filling completely within minutes. Mary was found beneath collapsed railings near a partially destroyed staircase corridor. Daniel's body was recovered farther inland the following morning. I can't even imagine what Mary was thinking in that moment, fighting the current, reaching for Daniel, and then being swept under herself. If you were in her place, watching someone you love disappear beneath that surge, what would you do? Emergency crews reached the property after debris was cleared from surrounding access roads. Dean and Mary were identified that evening. Investigators confirmed the outdoor tsunami warning system did not deliver a clear, audible alert across the resort during the critical window, and that staff communication during those moments was fragmented and overwhelmed by the speed of events. Authorities concluded all 3 deaths resulted from traumatic injuries and drowning during the surge, with the rapidly developing situation leaving little time for coordinated evacuation to reach everyone. We've got more horrifying tourist attraction disasters coming up, so hit that subscribe button if you want to see how some of the world's most famous destinations turned into scenes of absolute tragedy. It was November 9, 2015 in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, after hours of heavy rain had flooded roads and forced widespread closures. GPS systems began rerouting drivers onto unfamiliar secondary roads, sending some into hillside neighborhoods of narrow alleys and steep passages, areas where invisible territorial boundaries were only understood by locals. Clara Vance was 24 years old. She worked at a small animal grooming shop back in Florida. The kind of job that keeps you busy, pays the basics, and leaves you dreaming about the next trip out. She traveled to Rio with 2 friends for a long tourist weekend, drawn by the energy of the city and everything she'd seen of it online. They rented a compact SUV to move freely between areas without depending on crowded buses or expensive rides. Clara was the kind of traveler who documented everything, phone out, window down, filming whatever caught her eye as the city moved past. Their navigation app rerouted them uphill after rain blocked their intended road. The alley the GPS pushed them into was narrow enough that the mirrors nearly cleared the walls on both sides. Graffiti marked the concrete in ways that meant something to people who lived there. Burned scooters sat at the edges of the road. Storefront shutters were damaged and pulled down. Residents sheltering beneath tarps along the alley saw the SUV and immediately began gesturing downhill, shouting for the vehicle to turn around. Inside the car, the group interpreted this as harassment, the kind of thing tourists are warned about in unfamiliar cities. They kept moving. Armed lookouts positioned roughly 50 yards farther uphill had already seen the SUV entering the alley. The vehicle was a compact SUV, the same general type used by unmarked units during police operations in the area. That resemblance, in a neighborhood with a long history of unannounced raids, changed everything about how those men interpreted what was coming toward them. One lookout reportedly called out that the vehicle matched the profile of a police SUV. The driver of the rental didn't notice the armed men stepping into the street until the SUV was already deep enough into the alley that reversing required a full turn in a space that barely allowed it. He began trying to turn around. The gunfire started before the vehicle completed the maneuver. Rounds came from farther uphill, and the windshield and side windows shattered within seconds. Clara was sitting in the rear passenger seat with her phone out, filming the alley through the open window, when rounds penetrated the rear door and window beside her. One struck her upper chest. The driver was hit in the shoulder and lost control, sending the SUV sideways into a concrete fruit stand along the alley wall. Market stalls collapsed as residents nearby ran for cover through doorways and up staircases. The vehicle horn jammed after the collision and continued sounding continuously. Additional gunmen farther up the alley briefly opened fire toward the stopped vehicle before the shooting gradually slowed. Witnesses stated the firing stopped once armed lookouts approached the wrecked SUV on foot and saw the passengers inside. Terrified civilians with no police equipment, no weapons, no radios, nothing that matched what they had assumed was coming up that alley. The shooters withdrew uphill through narrow staircases while residents moved toward the vehicle and pulled surviving passengers out onto the wet pavement. Clara had collapsed sideways against the damaged doorframe. She stopped responding before emergency crews could safely enter the neighborhood. I keep thinking about that moment when the residents were waving them back, shouting for them to turn around. What if they hadn't misjudged it? I can't help but wonder if our story would have ended differently. Emergency responders entered the area only after local negotiators secured temporary access. Police documented more than 24 bullet impacts across the exterior of the SUV. Investigators stated the GPS rerouting during the rainstorm was the primary factor that pushed the vehicle into the restricted neighborhood. Clara was pronounced dead shortly after responders removed her from the rear seat. The cause of death was confirmed as a gunshot wound to the upper chest. Local authorities questioned several residents in the area, but released limited public details, citing safety concerns. The rental SUV was removed downhill under police escort by tow truck the following day. Clara's case stays with me because the danger wasn't something you could see coming. It was invisible right up until the moment it was too late. Our next story unfolds high above the streets of Florence, inside a centuries-old tower where a tourist slips past a restricted barrier looking for the perfect angle and turns a quiet stairwell into the last place she's ever seen alive. It was May 6th, 2018, in Florence, Italy. During a warm peak tourist afternoon, the cathedral plaza was packed, and Giotto's Campanile, a 277-foot bell tower clad in white, green, and pink marble, drew crowds climbing its narrow staircase to reach panoramic views of the city. Olivia Hart was 26 years old. She worked in a creative role at a design studio back in Chicago, the kind of work that trains your eye to notice composition, framing, and light in a way most people don't. She'd spent 2 weeks traveling across Italy specifically to document historic architecture for a photography page she'd been building online. Florence was one of the stops she had planned most carefully, and the tower was on the list. The problem was the crowds. By the time Olivia reached the upper observation platforms, every angle overlooking the city had someone standing in it. Groups clustered against the railings, phones raised, selfies, tour guides talking loudly in multiple languages. For someone trying to capture clean architectural footage without tourists filling the frame, it was genuinely frustrating. Being a photo enthusiast myself, I get the frustration when you've traveled all that way for a shot and every angle is blocked. But there's a big difference between adjusting for a better view and crossing into something that turns dangerous. Security footage later showed Olivia near a partially open maintenance door on one of the upper levels, while staff was occupied assisting a tourist farther down the staircase. The door led into a narrow stone corridor connecting to the upper bell chamber, a section used by maintenance crews to service lighting and mechanical systems, clearly marked in both Italian and English as restricted. Olivia slipped through the doorway, carrying a camera stabilizer and a small backpack, while nearby tourists continued upward toward the observation deck, completely unaware. Inside the maintenance corridor, the lighting dropped significantly compared to the public staircase. The stone steps leading toward the bell chamber were steep and worn smooth from centuries of use. Olivia climbed toward the upper section where several enormous suspended bells hung inside thick wooden support frames high above the city. The open stone arches framing the bells looked directly out over the Florence skyline. Exactly the kind of unobstructed, crowd-free angle she'd been looking for. Staff later confirmed that tourists were strictly prohibited from entering the bell chamber, specifically because the bells generated powerful swinging force within a very confined space, and scheduled ringing periods were not communicated to the public in advance. Witnesses inside the tower reported hearing the cathedral bells begin ringing shortly after Olivia entered the restricted section. Investigators believe she had moved close to one of the active bells while attempting to film the swinging mechanism with the skyline visible behind it. To get that shot, she stepped past the safer perimeter of the chamber and into the bell's swing clearance, positioning herself just inside the arc of motion so the moving bell would pass through her frame. In that position, she was only a few feet from the bell's path, leaving almost no margin for error once it began to move. I keep asking myself, is it really worth risking your life for just one photo? Still disoriented from the strike, she stumbled backward toward the edge of the archway opening while trying to regain her footing. The stone surface near the arch was worn and uneven. Witnesses in the cathedral plaza below reported seeing movement near one of the upper tower openings, moments before screaming began both inside the stairwell and outside in the plaza. Olivia fell through the exposed exterior arch and dropped toward the cathedral grounds below. Her camera stabilizer and phone struck lower rooftop sections of the structure separately before landing. Tourists in the plaza scattered in panic. Emergency responders sealed off portions of the surrounding plaza, while investigators examined the upper bell chamber and the maintenance corridor she had entered. Cathedral staff evacuated remaining tourists from the staircase and closed the tower immediately. Security footage confirmed Olivia had passed through the maintenance doorway minutes before the scheduled bell ringing began. Investigators concluded she died from catastrophic blunt force trauma sustained during the fall onto the stone pavement below. Officials reviewed maintenance access procedures and security surrounding the bell chamber entrance following the incident. The partially open maintenance door through which she entered was flagged in the investigation as a contributing factor.